In this series of videos, I'll provide students with suggestions for improving their case debating in the 2AC. This is the second video in the series. The first focused on strategy. Subsequent videos will provide specific tips about argumentation, efficiency, and how to practice. This video will focus on signposting. Signposting is a term used to describe the verbal signals a debater gives to the audience to let them know what argument is being answered. Their purpose is to clearly communicate points of clash, and they're essential to effective line-by-line debating. Good signposts are clear and consistent. By clear, I mean they are unambiguous. The judge knows exactly which arguments you are answering. This is achieved through vocal variation and emphasis. By consistent, I mean the debater uses the same method throughout their speech, never deviating from it. This gives the judge something to expect so they can clearly distinguish between arguments and the signposts used to organize them. Clarity and consistency are mutually reinforcing. It's hard to have one without the other. Clear and consistent signposts are the bedrock of effective 2AC case debating. Think about the context. When answering case arguments, the 2AC is speaking very quickly, mostly making analytical arguments, trying to communicate complicated content, and footnoting 1AC author names. If this is done without clear structure and organization, judges will catch little of what you're saying. Even if they're able to get some of it onto their flow, they won't be absorbing it. They'll just be struggling to maintain any record of your utterances and hope they can figure it out later if any of it becomes important. The difference between this and a 2AC on the case that the judge flows and understands is enormous. You've probably heard judges complain about 2ACs on the case. It's a common gripe. And they have a point. Bad 2ACs on the case are almost painful to experience. But this means that good 2ACs can really separate themselves from the crowd to make an immediate positive impression on their judge. How do you signpost effectively? There are three options for signposting case arguments in the 2AC. First, they say. Second, state the argument title. And third, state the opposite. You should master they say before moving on to state the argument title and state the opposite. In the rest of this video, I'll explain each signposting method in more detail and give you a few examples of how to do it right. They say is the most basic signposting method. It makes it very clear what you're doing. They said something, and now you're answering it. Here's an example. The image on the left shows two 1NC case arguments. Notice that they are prefaced with clear labels. This makes signposting your responses much easier. I've copied those labels on the right. ACLU model wrong and prisons not key. Here's how those arguments would be signposted in the they say model. It's pretty simple. They say ACLU model wrong, but your response. They say prisons not key, but your response. I'll go back to the previous image and show you it again. Again, here's how you would signpost these two arguments. Here's another slightly more difficult example. The image on the left includes the same two 1NC case arguments, but notice that they don't have clear labels. This requires a little bit more effort on the part of the 2AC. Your goal when labeling arguments for your opponents is to use the fewest words possible to clearly identify one and only one negative argument. If the judge might not be sure which argument you're referring to, you need to use another word or two. It's always better to be a bit more careful than to assume the judge will figure it out. This is how it works. First, you'd give each unlabeled argument a label. You've already seen the signpost that you'd use here, so this is easy. Second, you would signpost using those labels. Here's how that would look. You could give these arguments a different label. For example, we could label the first argument, assumes shelter in place, and the second argument, only if others flatten. If we use those labels, we'd signpost like this. Be careful when choosing your labels. A good label clearly refers to one and only one 1 and C argument. When done right, there will be almost no possibility that the judge will misunderstand what argument you're answering. State the argument title is a more difficult signposting method. It's slightly more efficient, but it also is much more likely to be confusing to the judge. The way it works is that instead of saying "they say," you just say the label of the negative's argument. We'll use the same example. The neg's arguments are ACLU model wrong and prisons not key. Here's how they're signposted. As you can see, the labels, e.g. ACLU model wrong, are stated and then the response begins with no extraneous words before or in between. I'll go back to the previous image so you can see it again. Here are the cards again, and here's how to signpost them. You save 3 words each time you use this method. They say, but. That's valuable, but you need to do 2 things in order for this to work. First, vary your vocal delivery of the argument titles. Because you're not saying "they say," the judge might not immediately recognize that you're signposting. Unless you vary your delivery, they might misunderstand you and think that you're making an argument for the other side, or at least be confused about what you're saying. You can experiment with different variations, but a bit of emphasis and uptalk tends to work. For example, ACLU model wrong, it's right because ... Or prison's not key, they are because ... Second, use precise labels. This is even more important in the state the argument title method than in the they say method. Even with vocal variation, there's more chance that your judge will be confused about which argument you're answering. State the opposite is the most difficult method of signposting. It's what you might have heard some people refer to as implicit clash. By stating the opposite of the argument's title, you are implying to the judge that they said the opposite. When done well, this can be highly effective. It's more efficient because it allows you to avoid repeating the negative's labels, so you can maintain a much faster rhythm while only making arguments. However, doing this well is very difficult. If you're not perfect, your judge will likely be confused and will miss important arguments. It's easy to get the implicit part of implicit clash right. It's the clash part that students tend to struggle with. In this method, stating the opposite must be done clearly and consistently, or the only thing you'll be implying to your judge is that you can't do line-by-line refutation. Here's how it works. We'll use the same example again. Instead of repeating the label, you switch the label into its answer. ACLU model wrong becomes ACLU model right. Prisons not key becomes prisons are key. I'll go back and show it to you again. Here are the 1 and C cards with their labels. And here is how you would signpost them. As with the state the argument title method, the state the opposite method requires that you vary your vocal delivery to signify that you are signposting. You can experiment with different ways to do this, but I suggest adding emphasis on the part of the label that you've changed. ACLU model right, or prisons are key. The judge needs to know that you're signposting, and your labels need to be clear. If you don't state precisely the opposite label, this method doesn't work at all. Prefer F models, while implicitly an answer to ACLU model wrong, won't register that way to your judge. The same is true of no alt causes. While implicitly an answer to prison's not key, it won't be clear to your judge that you're doing line-by-line refutation unless you use the opposite label. For any of the three methods of signposting, you can also consider adding 1NC number before the signpost. For the they say method, this would be 1NC1, they say X, but your response. For the state the argument title method, this would be 1NC1, X, but your response. For the state the opposite method, this would be 1NC1, X. Here's an example. This can sometimes be a very useful supplement to your signposting. For it to be useful though, the 1NC argument numbers need to be clear enough that you and the judge will have them numbered identically. This is typically only the case if the 1NC hard numbered their front lines, or if they were extremely clear, and especially if there were a limited number of case arguments. In these situations, it can be useful to add this preface to your signposts, especially if you're attempting one of the more difficult methods. 1NC1 plus state the opposite can be much clearer than state the opposite by itself. How do you choose the signposting method that's right for you? Start with they say. Once you've mastered it, you can experiment with state the argument title and state the opposite if and only if you're good enough that relatively minor efficiency gains can make a difference in your win probability. Until you've reached that point where efficiency gains might make a big difference, it's better to stick with the basic model. Some of the best 2As never deviate from it, even as they reach the highest levels of competition. The other variable to consider is the clarity of the 1NC's labels. If the case arguments you're answering were particularly unlabeled and confusing, it's best to stick with they say and to do your best to give each argument a label. This gives you more control over how much your judge is likely to flow than the more sophisticated but higher margin of error techniques. In this video, I've explained how to signpost 2AC case arguments. Remember, clear and consistent signposting is the foundation of effective 2AC case debating. If you can't signpost well, you can't debate the case well in the 2AC. Period. If you haven't done so already, I suggest that you watch the first video in this series about the strategy of 2AC case debating. Subsequent videos will also address other specific issues including argumentation, efficiency, and how to practice. I hope this video was helpful. Thank you for watching.